My name is Sarah, and I never thought I'd be sharing this story. Honestly, I don't even know if I'm the kind of person people will believe. But what I experienced changed me so profoundly that keeping it to myself feels like a betrayal. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what I was shown, what I learned, and what I believe we all need to hear. You might feel skeptical at first, but I hope you'll stick with me. Because if you had seen what I've seen, you'd know why I can't stay silent. It was a Friday night, cold and rainy, and I was finally heading home after an exhausting 12-hour shift at the hospital. Nursing isn't just a job for me, it's my calling. But that night, the weight of it felt different. I'd been running on fumes all day, barely making it through back-to-back emergencies. My scrubs were damp from spilled coffee and sweat, and my feet ached so badly I was afraid I might not be able to get out of the car when I finally got home. All I wanted was to see Daniel. My husband had a way of making everything better with just a smile or a warm hug. Even after 10 years of marriage, his love still felt like a safe harbor. The rain came down in torrents as I merged onto the highway. I could barely see the taillights ahead of me through the blurry haze of water and darkness. My windshield wipers struggled, squeaking against the glass, and I turned up the defrost to keep the windows from fogging. The radio was on, but I wasn't paying attention to the music. My thoughts drifted to Daniel and our 2 boys, wondering if they'd already gone to bed or if Daniel had stayed up to wait for me. He always did that, sat on the couch with a cup of tea and the lamp on, just so I wouldn't walk into a dark house. It was such a small thing, but it meant the world to me. I didn't see the truck until it was too late. One moment, the road stretched out ahead of me in a gray, rain-slicked blur. The next, there were blinding headlights in my peripheral vision. My chest seized with panic as I heard the screech of brakes and the low, terrifying growl of tires hydroplaning on wet asphalt. I felt my car jerk to the side, and then everything was chaos. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and my body was thrown forward against the seatbelt so hard I couldn't breathe. For a split second, the world seemed to tilt, and then there was nothing but silence. But it wasn't just silence. It was a stillness so profound that it felt like the entire universe had paused. I couldn't feel my body anymore. No pain, no pressure, nothing. It was like I'd been released from it entirely, and for a moment that thought terrified me. Was I dead? Was this what dying felt like? I tried to look around, but I couldn't move my head. That's when I realized I wasn't in my body anymore. I was above it. I saw myself. My car was crumpled like a tin can. The driver's side smashed in, and I was slumped forward in the seat, blood streaking my face. The sight should have horrified me, but it didn't. It was strange. There was no fear, no panic, just a detached sense of curiosity. I watched as if I were observing someone else entirely. My body was there, broken and fragile, but I wasn't in it. I was somewhere else, hovering in the air, weightless and untethered. That's when I felt it. A pull, gentle but insistent, like an invisible thread, was tugging me upward. The world below me began to fade, the shattered car and flashing lights of the oncoming vehicles dissolving into a soft, golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't blinding, though. It was warm, soothing, and it wrapped around me like a blanket. I felt myself moving toward it, though I wasn't walking or flying. I was simply being carried. I don't know how to explain what happened next without sounding like I'm making it up. As I moved closer to the light, I began to hear something. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard before. Not music, not voices, but something that seemed to be both and more. It vibrated in me, filling every part of my being with a sense of peace so overwhelming that I felt tears welling up in my eyes. It was the kind of peace that makes you realize how heavy you've been all your life, carrying burdens you didn't even know were there until they were lifted. Then, the light shifted. It began to take shape, forming into something or someone. I couldn't see a face at first, but I felt a presence, strong and unmistakable. It was a love so vast and pure that it brought me to my knees, not physically because I didn't have a body anymore, but spiritually. I was bowing before it, humbled and awestruck, and then I heard a voice. Sarah. It was a single word, but it resonated through me like the ringing of a bell. It wasn't just a voice, it was the truth. The kind of truth you don't question because every fiber of your soul recognizes it. And in that moment, I knew who it was. I didn't need to see his face, I knew. Do not be afraid. he said, his voice calm and steady, yet carrying a weight that seemed to hold the universe in balance. And I wasn't afraid. In fact, the fear I thought I should feel, fear of death, fear of the unknown, fear of this overwhelming presence, was completely gone. In its place was a love so powerful, so encompassing, that I couldn't imagine how I'd lived my entire life without truly knowing it. "I'm dead, aren't I?" The words came out without hesitation. I didn't even know if I was speaking them, but the thought was so clear it felt as though I had. "You are here," he said, not confirming nor denying, but his tone made it clear that I wasn't here by accident. "There is something you must see, something you must understand." Before I could ask what he meant, the space around me began to change. The golden light shifted, softening into a new kind of radiance, and suddenly I wasn't standing, or floating, or whatever I was doing before him anymore. Instead, I was somewhere else entirely. It was my living room. Our living room. The worn, beige couch we'd bought secondhand years ago sat against the wall, and the scratched coffee table still bore faint crayon marks from when the boys were toddlers. The light above the dining table flickered slightly, just like it always did when the heater kicked on. Everything was so vivid, so familiar, that for a moment I thought I'd somehow returned to my body and gone home. But then I saw them. Daniel was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. His shoulders were hunched, his whole frame trembling with a grief that made my heart ache. On the floor beside him were our boys, Ethan and Caleb, their small faces streaked with tears. Caleb clutched his favorite stuffed dinosaur, the one he never slept without, and Ethan was holding his little brother's hand, whispering something I couldn't make out. They couldn't see me. They couldn't hear me. I reached out instinctively, desperate to comfort them, but my hand, if I even had one, passed through them like mist. A sob built in my chest, though I wasn't sure I even had a chest anymore. All I knew was that I wanted to hold them, to tell them I was there, that everything was going to be okay. "This is what they will feel if you don't go back." His voice came again, gentle yet firm, as though it carried the weight of every truth I had ever ignored. I turned, and he was there again. Not standing, not floating, just present. His light filled the room, yet it didn't blind or obscure anything. It illuminated everything. I could see the fine lines on Daniel's face, the way his hands clenched into fists, the tear that slipped down Ethan's cheek. I saw the pain in all of them, raw and unfiltered, and it crushed me. "I can't leave them like this," I whispered, though the words felt hollow against the enormity of what I was witnessing. "You have always had a choice," he said, "and you still do, but there is more I must show you." Before I could respond, the scene changed again. It was seamless, like turning a page in a book. One moment I was standing in my living room, and the next I was somewhere else entirely. It was a memory. My memory. I was watching Daniel and me on our wedding day. We stood at the altar, young and bright-eyed, the whole world ahead of us. I could see the way we looked at each other, the way Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto my finger. I could feel the love in that moment, so pure and full of hope. But then the memory shifted, like fast-forwarding through time. I saw the highs and lows of our marriage play out before me in vivid detail. I saw the nights we stayed up talking until dawn, planning our future and dreaming big dreams. I saw the arguments, too, the slammed doors, the silence that stretched like a canyon between us. I saw the times I'd pulled away, too tired or too stubborn to meet him halfway, and then I saw something I wasn't prepared for. I saw Daniel sitting alone in the dark, long before the accident, his head in his hands just like in the earlier vision. I saw the weight he carried, the pressures of work, of fatherhood, of being the steady rock our family relied on. I saw his silent prayers, the ones I never knew about, whispered into the void when he thought no one was listening. "You have not truly seen him," Jesus said, his voice soft but firm. "Not as I see him." Tears streamed down my face, though I wasn't sure how that was even possible. "I love him," I whispered. "I've always loved him." "Love is more than feeling," he said. "It is a choice, a commitment, a reflection of the love I have shown you. But too often, you have allowed the world to distract you from this truth." The words pierced me like an arrow. I thought about all the times I'd taken Daniel for granted, the little moments I'd brushed aside, the ways I'd let exhaustion or frustration get in the way of showing him how much he meant to me. I thought about the nights I'd scrolled mindlessly through my phone instead of listening to him, the mornings I'd rushed out the door without kissing him goodbye. You were given a gift in him, Jesus continued. And he in you. Marriage is not just a bond of this world. It is a reflection of the covenant I have made with my people. It is sacred, and it is under attack. His words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that life had been hard, that I'd done my best. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had let the distractions of life cloud what was truly important. Do you understand now? He asked. I nodded, though the weight of what I was being shown pressed heavily on my soul. Yes, I said, my voice trembling. I understand. The moment I said the words, everything shifted again. The golden light surrounded me, and for a brief second, I thought it might be over, that I might wake up in my broken body and try to piece together the life I had just seen from a new perspective. But then I realized he wasn't done. This time, I wasn't in a place I recognized. It was like stepping into a vast expanse of nothingness and everything all at once. The light was still there, but now it seemed to stretch infinitely, and I could feel its presence in a way that words fail to describe. In the distance, or maybe it wasn't distance at all, I saw something emerging. It was as though images were being painted across the air itself, forming into vivid scenes that felt impossibly real. The first image was of a man and a woman standing side by side. They were holding hands, their faces aglow with joy. Around them was a garden, lush and vibrant, more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. It didn't take long for me to understand what I was looking at. This was the beginning, the beginning. I was seeing Adam and Eve. Their connection was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. It wasn't just love or attraction, it was unity in its purest form. They were perfectly in sync, not just with each other but with the world around them, as if they were an extension of it. For a moment, I felt a pang of longing, wondering if that kind of perfect unity was even possible in the brokenness of the world I knew. But then, the scene shifted. It happened so quickly, like a crack forming in a mirror. The garden grew darker, the light dimmed, and I saw Adam and Eve standing apart now, their hands no longer joined. There was confusion on their faces, a kind of sorrow I recognized but had never fully understood until now. Do you see? His voice broke through the vision, and I turned toward him, though I still couldn't truly look at him. Yes, I said quietly. I see what was lost. He nodded, but there was sorrow in his tone. Marriage was created to reflect the unity between myself and my people. It was a covenant, pure and undefiled, meant to bring life, love, and joy. But when the trust was broken, so too was the bond. Since that moment, the enemy has sought to destroy what I created. I didn't need him to explain who he meant by the enemy. The darkness I'd seen creeping into the garden had been enough. The images continued, showing the ripple effects of that broken trust. I saw marriages fractured by betrayal, by selfishness, by neglect. I saw generations of pain passed down like a legacy no one wanted but no one could escape. And yet, in the midst of it all, I also saw something else. Flashes of light, scattered and faint at first, began to break through the scenes of pain. I saw couples kneeling together in prayer, their hands clasped tightly. I saw acts of forgiveness that defied logic, moments of sacrifice that rekindled love. I saw children watching their parents love and learning what it meant to be cherished. It's not hopeless, I whispered, more to myself than to him. No, he said, but the fight is greater now than ever before. The enemy has adapted, creating new ways to divide, to distract, to destroy. Many do not even realize they are being deceived. Before I could ask what he meant, the images shifted again. This time, I saw something that made my heart ache with recognition. A man and woman sat in the same room, but they weren't together. He was scrolling through his phone, oblivious to her silent tears as she stared at the floor. I saw her pick up her own device, her thumb aimlessly flicking through endless images and posts, a hollow expression on her face. They were side by side, yet miles apart. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I knew what I was being shown, and it cut deeper than I was ready for. This is how it begins, he said, his voice filled with sorrow. Small, seemingly harmless distractions that grow into walls, moments of connection replaced by moments of isolation. And when the storms come, those walls collapse, leaving nothing but rubble. Tears streamed down my face again. How do we stop it? I asked, my voice breaking. How do we fight it? By remembering, he said. By choosing, love is not a feeling that comes and goes. It is a commitment, a daily decision. Just as I chose you, even knowing the cost, so too must you choose each other. His words struck something deep within me. I thought of all the times I'd let distractions steal moments that could have been spent building something stronger. I thought of the times I'd let bitterness fester instead of reaching out in love. But what about the world? I asked. The forces we can't control, the things pulling people apart every day. He looked at me then, or at least I felt him looking at me. His light seemed to grow brighter, filling every part of me with warmth. You can only control what you choose, but your choice has more power than you realize. A single act of love, a single moment of choosing to stay, to forgive, to fight for what matters, it creates ripples. And those ripples can change the world. The images faded, leaving us in the vast expanse of light once again. I felt the weight of everything I'd seen, the truth of it pressing into me like a brand. But I also felt hope, fragile but real. You must go back, he said, and my heart clenched. I don't know if I'm strong enough, I admitted. You are not alone, he replied, and you never will be. And with that, the light began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled back into the world I'd left behind. The transition back was jarring, like being ripped from the warmest embrace and plunged into icy water. At first, there was nothing but darkness, heavy and suffocating. Then, faintly, I began to hear sounds. Beeping, muffled voices, the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. Pain followed shortly after. It surged through me in waves, sharp and relentless, reminding me of the broken body I was being dragged back into. My chest felt like it had been crushed, every breath a struggle, but the pain didn't matter. I was alive. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I was met with the fluorescent glare of hospital lights. The room was blurry at first, but as my vision adjusted, I saw Daniel sitting beside me. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, but when he saw me stir, relief flooded his expression. "You're awake," he whispered, his voice cracking. He leaned forward, his hand trembling as he reached for mine. I tried to speak, but my throat felt raw, like sandpaper. A weak sound escaped me, and Daniel immediately grabbed a small cup of water from the tray beside the bed, holding the straw to my lips. I sipped, the cool liquid soothing the burning dryness in my throat. "Don't try to talk too much," he said softly. "You've been out for days. They weren't sure if—" He trailed off, his voice breaking, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. I squeezed his hand as tightly as I could, which wasn't much. "I'm here," I rasped, my voice barely audible. His head dipped, and I felt his forehead press against my hand. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. As I lay there, weak and broken, I felt a swell of love for this man I had taken for granted in so many ways. The vision of him in our living room, broken and grieving, flashed in my mind. I couldn't bear to imagine putting him through that pain, through the agony of being left to carry the weight of our family alone. "I'm sorry," I managed to whisper. He lifted his head, confusion flickering across his face. "Sorry for what?" "For everything," I said, my voice trembling. "For not seeing you the way I should have, for not being there the way I promised I would be." Daniel shook his head, his grip on my hand tightening. "You don't have to apologize for anything. You've been everything to me, everything." Tears streamed down my face, the weight of my experience still heavy on my heart. I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd seen, what I'd been shown. Not yet. But I knew one thing, I had to live differently. Over the next few days, I slowly regained my strength. The doctors and nurses called my recovery miraculous, marveling at how quickly my body was healing despite the severity of my injuries. I knew better. I hadn't just been pulled back to life by chance. I had been sent back with a purpose and a mission I couldn't ignore. Daniel rarely left my side, even when I insisted he go home to rest. "I'm not leaving you," he'd say every time, his eyes unwavering. I saw him differently now, not just as my husband but as a gift, a reflection of the covenant I'd been shown, the bond I had taken for granted. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast golden light across the hospital room, I finally told him. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice still weak but steadier than it had been in days. He pulled his chair closer, his hand still wrapped around mine. "What is it?" I hesitated, unsure where to begin. How do you explain something so profound, so otherworldly? How do you put into words the weight of a truth that changes everything? When I was gone, I started, the word feeling strange and heavy on my tongue. I saw things. I saw you and the boys. I saw what it would have been like if I hadn't come back. Daniel's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. I met him, I said, my voice trembling. Jesus, he showed me everything. The good, the bad, things I didn't want to see but needed to. His eyes widened, a mix of awe and confusion crossing his face. You saw Jesus. I nodded, tears welling up again. He showed me what marriage was meant to be, how sacred it is, how it reflects his love for us, and how easily we lose sight of that. He showed me how I'd let distractions, selfishness, and pride get in the way of loving you the way I promised I would. Daniel stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I worried he wouldn't believe me, that he'd dismiss it as some fevered dream or hallucination. But then he leaned forward, his forehead pressing against mine, and I felt the warmth of his tears. I don't know what to say, he whispered. But I believe you, and I love you, I always have. A sob broke free from my chest, and I clung to him as tightly as I could. In that moment, I felt a piece of the bond we had lost begin to mend, like a cracked vase being carefully glued back together. As the days turned into weeks and I continued to heal, I couldn't shake the urgency of the message I'd been given. I knew it wasn't just for me or for our marriage. It was bigger than that. Love is a choice, I had been told, a daily decision. And I knew now that it wasn't just about grand gestures or fleeting feelings. It was about the little things, choosing patience when frustration threatened to take over, choosing kindness when harsh words came more easily, choosing to listen, to forgive, to stay. And so, as I sat in that hospital bed with Daniel's hand in mine, I made a promise, not just to him, but to the one who had sent me back. I would choose love. Every day, for the rest of my life. The day I returned home from the hospital was a mix of overwhelming gratitude and quiet fear. The world felt different, sharper, almost too vivid. Every color seemed brighter, every sound clearer, as if the veil of everyday life had been lifted and I could see things for what they truly were. I felt raw, exposed. But more than anything, I felt the weight of the responsibility I had been given. Daniel and the boys welcomed me with cautious joy. They had been through their own trauma, watching me fight for my life, uncertain if I'd ever return to them. The boys didn't fully understand what had happened, but their hugs lingered longer, and their eyes held a kind of worry that broke my heart. "Mommy's okay now," I whispered to them, pulling them close. "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." That night, after the boys were asleep, Daniel and I sat together on the couch. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could feel his eyes on me, searching, waiting. "You haven't told me everything, have you?" he finally asked, his voice soft but steady. I shook my head, my fingers twisting nervously in my lap. "No," I admitted. "There's so much, Daniel, more than I know how to explain." "Try," he urged gently, placing his hand over mine. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. He showed me the fractures, the ways we've been pulled apart, not just us, but everyone. Families, marriages, communities. The enemy is clever, Daniel. He doesn't always come with chaos and destruction. Sometimes he comes quietly, slipping in through distractions and complacency, turning love into something transactional, something fragile. Daniel's jaw tightened, his grip on my hand firming. "It's hard to argue with that," he said after a moment. "I've felt it even if I didn't know how to name it. The distance, the busyness, sometimes it feels like we're just surviving, not really living." I nodded, tears pooling in my eyes. That's what he showed me. We're meant for more than survival. We're meant to thrive, to love deeply, to reflect his love in everything we do. But it's not easy. It's a fight, a constant, deliberate choice to push back against everything trying to pull us apart. Daniel was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I don't want to lose you again," he said. "I don't want to lose us." "You won't," I promised, my voice trembling. "We won't let that happen, but it means we have to be intentional. We have to fight for this for each other every single day." He nodded, and in that moment, I saw the determination in his eyes, the quiet strength that had carried him through my absence. The days that followed were filled with small but significant changes. We started praying together every morning, even when it felt awkward or forced. We carved out time to talk, really talk, without distractions. I began paying closer attention to the boys, noticing the little things I used to overlook. How my youngest liked to hum while he colored, how my eldest's eyes lit up when he talked about dinosaurs. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of frustration, of exhaustion, of falling back into old habits. But each time, I remembered the light, the voice, the vision of what could be. And I chose to try again. One afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea and watching the boys play in the backyard, I felt a familiar warmth wash over me. It wasn't the same overwhelming presence I had felt in the light, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't alone. "You're doing it," I heard the whisper in my heart. "One choice at a time." Tears filled my eyes, and I whispered back, "Thank you." The message I had been given wasn't just for me or for my family. It was for anyone willing to listen, anyone searching for hope in the midst of their struggles. But I didn't know how to share it, how to convey something so profound without sounding like I'd lost my mind. One evening, as Daniel and I sat together after the boys were asleep, I shared my dilemma with him. "I feel like I'm supposed to tell people what I saw, what I learned," I said. "But how do I do that without sounding, I don't know, crazy?" He thought for a moment, then smiled. "You tell your story, that's all you can do. Some people will believe you, some won't. But if even one person is changed because of what you've experienced, isn't it worth it?" His words stayed with me, and over time I began to find ways to share my story. It started small, conversations with friends, a few hesitant posts online. But as I opened up, I found that people were hungry for hope, for connection, for a reminder that love and faith were worth fighting for. I don't know what the future holds or how far this ripple will spread, but I do know this. I was sent back for a reason. I was given a glimpse of something greater, something worth striving for. And no matter how hard the fight, I will keep choosing love, because in the end, it's not just about me or Daniel or our boys. It's about reflecting the light I saw, the love I felt in every moment, every choice, every day. Over time, my story began to take on a life of its own. It spread further than I ever imagined, first through whispered conversations and then in ways I couldn't control. People I'd never met reached out, some with curiosity, others with skepticism, but many with stories of their own. Stories of broken marriages, fading faith, and the quiet ache of lives lived on autopilot. At first, I wasn't sure how to respond. Who was I to give advice? I wasn't a pastor or a counselor, just a woman who had been shown a glimpse of something extraordinary. But I remembered what Daniel had told me. Share your story. So I did. Every time I spoke about what I'd experienced, I felt the same mix of vulnerability and purpose. I talked about the vision, about the weight of the choices we make every day and how we love and forgive. I told them about the warmth of the light, the peace I'd felt, and the reminder that no matter how far we stray, we're always being called back to something greater. It wasn't always easy. Some people dismissed me outright, their skepticism sharp and cutting. Others looked at me with pity, as if I'd suffered some kind of trauma-induced delusion. Those moments stung, but they were far outweighed by the connections I made with those who listened. One night, I received an email from a woman named Maria. She wrote about her marriage of 20 years, how it had slowly eroded under the weight of resentment and neglect. "Your story made me realize how much I've been holding on to things that don't matter," she wrote. "I thought love was supposed to just happen, but I see now that it's something we have to fight for. Thank you for reminding me before it was too late." I sat with her words for a long time, tears streaming down my face. If my experience had been meant for no one else, it had been worth it for Maria. As the weeks turned into months, I felt a deepening sense of purpose. Daniel and I continued to work on our marriage, and while it was far from perfect, it was real. We argued, we laughed, we cried, but through it all, we chose each other. The boys seemed to notice the change, too. There was a new warmth in our home, a sense of togetherness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that life had suddenly become easy. It was that we faced its challenges together, with intention and grace. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, my youngest son asked, "Mommy, why do you cry when you talk about Jesus?" The question caught me off guard, and I glanced at Daniel, who gave me a small, encouraging smile. "Because he loves us so much," I said, my voice trembling. "And because he showed me how important it is to love each other the same way." My eldest frowned thoughtfully. Like how you and Daddy are nicer to each other now. I couldn't help but laugh through my tears. Yes, sweetheart. Exactly like that. Their innocent questions reminded me of the simplicity of what I had been shown. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect lives. It was about choosing love again and again in the small, everyday moments. But the deeper I delved into this calling, the more I felt the weight of the vision pressing on me. There was one part I hadn't shared, not even with Daniel. The part where I had seen not just the beauty of love, but the darkness that threatened to destroy it. In the vision, I had been shown a world consumed by distractions, where families drifted apart without even realizing it. The enemy's tactics weren't loud or obvious, they were subtle. A husband scrolling through his phone instead of listening to his wife. A mother too exhausted to play with her children. A society so focused on self that it forgot how to serve. The message had been clear. The battle for love and connection wasn't just personal. It was global and it was urgent. One night, as Daniel and I sat on the porch watching the stars, I decided to tell him. "There's something I haven't told you," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it?" I hesitated, the weight of the words pressing down on me. In the vision, I didn't just see what could be, I saw what's already happening. Families falling apart, people losing each other, losing themselves, and it's not just because of big, obvious things. It's the little things, the everyday choices that pull us away from what matters. Daniel's expression darkened and he reached for my hand. "What do we do?" I took a deep breath, the enormity of the question settling over me. "We fight back," I said. "Not with anger or fear, but with love, by being present, by choosing each other even when it's hard. By showing the world that it's possible to live differently." He nodded, his grip on my hand firm. "Then that's what we'll do." In the weeks that followed, we began finding small ways to live out that mission. We volunteered together as a family, reaching out to neighbors who were struggling. We hosted dinners, inviting friends and strangers alike to share in the warmth of community. And slowly, we began to see the ripple effect. People started asking questions, not just about my story, but about how they could change their own lives. And as they did, I saw the same light in their eyes that I had seen in the vision. The light of hope, of love, of something greater than themselves. I don't know how far this journey will take me or how many lives it will touch. But I do know this. The light I saw, the love I felt, wasn't just meant for me. It was meant to be shared, one choice, one moment, one life at a time. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk answering messages from strangers who had read or heard about my story, I felt an ache deep in my chest. It wasn't physical. It was something else. Something emotional, spiritual even. The messages were overwhelming, and while many of them were full of gratitude and hope, others were heavy with pain. A man named Brian wrote about his wife leaving him after 25 years of marriage. "I don't think I've ever really loved her the way I should have," he confessed. "I took her for granted, and now it's too late." Another woman named Elise spoke of her constant battle with guilt as a single mother, working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. "I barely see my kids anymore," she wrote. "I feel like I'm failing them, like I'm failing myself. How can I fix this when I'm already so broken?" Their words weighed on me, and for the first time since my near-death experience, doubt began to creep in. Who was I to offer guidance to these people? My own marriage had been hanging by a thread before my NDE. My own parenting had been imperfect, marked by impatience and distraction. That evening, as Daniel and the boys played in the living room, I stepped outside to breathe. The air was cool, the sky a deep shade of twilight, and the faint scent of rain lingered in the breeze. I closed my eyes and let the sounds of crickets and distant wind chimes wash over me, grounding me in the moment. "Am I enough for this?" I whispered into the stillness. "Am I doing what you want me to do?" The response wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. A calm warmth enveloped me, the same kind I had felt during my NDE, and a thought came to my mind so clearly it might as well have been spoken aloud. It's not about being perfect. It's about being faithful. Tears slipped down my cheeks and I nodded, even though no one was there to see it. I didn't have to have all the answers. I didn't have to fix anyone's life. I just had to share what I'd been shown and trust that it would plant seeds where they were needed. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. I began responding to messages, not with advice or solutions, but with encouragement and compassion. To Brian, I wrote, "It's never too late to show love. Even if your marriage is over, you can still reflect on what you've learned and carry that into the relationships ahead." To Elise, I wrote, "You're not failing. You're doing the best you can in a difficult situation. Sometimes love looks like sacrifice, and your kids will see that someday. Be kind to yourself and don't be afraid to ask for help." Slowly, I began to realize that my role wasn't to be an expert or a savior. It was to be a witness, to remind people that they weren't alone, that there was always hope, always light, even in the darkest moments. One day, I received an invitation to speak at a local church. The thought terrified me. Sharing my story one-on-one or in writing was one thing, but standing in front of a room full of people, that felt like an entirely different challenge. "You should do it," Daniel said when I told him about the invitation. "But what if I freeze?" I asked, my voice tinged with anxiety. "What if they think I'm crazy?" He smiled and took my hands in his. "If even one person is touched by what you say, it's worth it. And besides, you've faced death, Jenna. You can handle a room full of churchgoers." His confidence in me gave me the courage I needed. The day of the event, I stood in the front row, heart pounding as the pastor introduced me. When I stepped onto the stage, the bright lights and sea of faces made me want to retreat, but I took a deep breath and began. "My name is Jenna," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "and I never thought I'd be standing here telling this story. But after what I experienced, I realize I don't have a choice." As I spoke, the fear melted away, replaced by a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. I told them about the accident, the light, and the voice that had filled me with both peace and urgency. I shared the vision of fractured families and forgotten love, and the reminder that we are called to fight for each other, to choose love every day, even when it's hard. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. But it wasn't the applause that moved me. It was the tear-filled eyes of the people who came up to me afterward, sharing their own struggles, their own hopes, their own commitments to try again. From that day forward, the opportunities to share my story multiplied. I spoke at schools, community centers, and even larger churches. Each time, I felt the same mixture of vulnerability and strength, the same reminder that it wasn't about me. It was about the message. But as the ripple effect of my story grew, so did the challenges. Not everyone welcomed the message. There were those who dismissed me as a fraud, others who accused me of exploiting people's pain for attention. The criticism stung, but I clung to the truth of what I had experienced, trusting that the light I'd been shown would continue to guide me, and through it all, my family became my anchor. Daniel remained my unwavering supporter, and the boys grew up surrounded by a home filled with love and faith. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And that, I realized, was all that mattered. One evening, long after the boys had gone to bed, I sat on the couch with Daniel, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. We were both exhausted, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from a day spent fully present with the people you love. As I leaned my head against his shoulder, he asked, "Do you ever wonder why it was you, why you were given that vision?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "All the time," I admitted. "I'm not special. I'm not holier than anyone else. I've made so many mistakes. Sometimes I wonder if I was just in the right place or the wrong place at the right time." He nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's exactly why it was you. Because you're not perfect. Because you know what it's like to struggle, to fight for what matters." His words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I continued to navigate this unexpected journey. The more I shared my story, the more I realized that it wasn't about perfection or even about having all the answers. It was about being a bridge, a connection between the light I had seen and the lives of the people who were searching for it in their own way. One day, I received an invitation that felt different from the others. It wasn't to speak at a church or community event, but to share my story on a national platform. A television program had heard about my near-death experience and wanted to feature me in a special segment about faith and spirituality. The idea was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. This was a chance to reach so many more people, but it also meant opening myself up to scrutiny on a much larger scale. What if they twist my words? I asked Daniel as we discussed it. What if they make me sound crazy or turn this into something it's not? He reached across the table and took my hand. You've always trusted the message, Jenna. Trust it now. It doesn't matter how they frame it. What matters is that people hear it. The ones who need it will hear it. His reassurance gave me the courage to say yes. A few weeks later, I found myself sitting under the bright lights of a television studio, my hands folded tightly in my lap as the host introduced me. Tonight, we're joined by Jenna Thompson, a wife and mother who says she experienced something extraordinary during a near-death experience. She claims to have received a message about love, marriage, and the importance of connection, a message she's now sharing with the world. I braced myself as the cameras turned to me, but the host's warm smile helped ease my nerves. Jenna, she began, thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little about what happened to you? As I recounted my story once again, I felt the same mixture of vulnerability and purpose that I always did. I spoke about the accident, the light, and the overwhelming sense of peace I had felt. I described the vision of fractured families and the message I had been given about the importance of choosing love, even in the face of challenges. The host listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly. What would you say to someone who's skeptical? She asked. To someone who might think this was just a dream or a hallucination. I paused, considering my words carefully. I can't prove what I experienced, I said honestly, but I don't think that's the point. Whether it was a vision, a dream, or something else entirely, the message it left me with is real. We all have the power to choose love, to forgive, to fight for what matters. And I think that's something we can all hold on to, no matter what we believe. The segment aired a week later, and the response was overwhelming. My inbox was flooded with messages from people across the country, some skeptical, yes, but many more who resonated deeply with the story. A woman named Linda wrote, I've been struggling in my marriage for years, but hearing your story gave me the push I needed to have an honest conversation with my husband. We're starting counseling next week. A man named Victor shared, your message about being present hit me hard. I've been so caught up in work that I've been neglecting my kids. Thank you for reminding me what's really important. Each message felt like a confirmation that the vision I had been given wasn't just for me. It was for them, for all of us. But as the days went on, I began to notice something else, a resistance, a pushback that wasn't just from skeptics but from within myself. Sharing my story on such a large scale had exposed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Strangers debated my credibility, my faith, even my sanity. One particularly harsh comment stuck with me. She's just doing this for attention. Another fraud trying to profit off people's pain. The words cut deep, and for a moment I questioned everything. Was I doing the right thing? Was I truly following the calling I had been given, or was I letting my ego take over? That night I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling and prayed. God, if this is truly what you want me to do, please show me, please guide me. The answer didn't come immediately, but when it did, it was unmistakable. As I drifted off to sleep, I had a dream, not as vivid as my NDE, but powerful nonetheless. I saw a single candle burning in the darkness, its flames small but steady. Around it, other candles began to light, one by one, until the room was filled with warmth and light. When I woke, I understood. The work I was doing wasn't about me. It wasn't about the criticism or the praise. It was about being that first candle, sharing the light I had been given so that others could carry it forward. And so I continued, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. As the months passed, I found myself more deeply immersed in the journey that had unfolded before me. It was as if the vision I had received during my near-death experience had opened a door to a new life, one I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I sometimes wished I could. I had always been someone who liked routine, who thrived on predictability. But now, everything was unpredictable. Opportunities to share my story kept coming, each one a little bigger than the last. The platform grew, but so did the weight of it. I wasn't just sharing my story anymore. I was being asked to speak into people's lives in ways I hadn't anticipated. People weren't just listening, they were asking for answers. One afternoon, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, trying to process the latest invitation. a speaking tour across the country, sponsored by a large religious organization. The excitement of the opportunity was palpable, but so was the fear. The more I spoke, the more I realized how much responsibility came with it. This was bigger than I had ever imagined. Daniel walked in, seeing the unease in my expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting next to me. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "It's like everything's moving so fast. I'm being asked to speak at places I never dreamed I'd be, but am I ready for this?" "You've been ready your whole life," he said with his usual calm assurance. "I know it's overwhelming, but you've been walking this path for so long now. You're not doing this alone. You're sharing something that's bigger than you." His words were comforting, but the weight of the decision still pressed on me. What if I let people down? What if my message wasn't enough? The next day, I received an email from someone who had attended one of my recent talks. Her name was Sarah, and her words stopped me cold. "I just wanted to reach out to thank you," she wrote. "Your message about love and marriage touched me more than you'll ever know. I've been married for 15 years, but we've been struggling for so long. I didn't know if we could make it. But after hearing your story, I talked to my husband, and we both realized that we've been living side by side instead of together. We're working on it now, and I'm hoping we can rebuild what we once had." Reading her words, I felt a surge of warmth mixed with something else, fear. What if Sarah and her husband couldn't rebuild? What if it was too late for them too? The weight of these questions hung in the air, and for a moment I questioned the message I had been sharing. Was it too optimistic? Was I giving people false hope? I spent hours thinking about it, my mind racing until I finally realized that the hope wasn't about a perfect outcome. It was about the effort, the decision to choose love, to fight for what you believe in, even when it's hard. I wasn't promising easy solutions. I was just showing people that they didn't have to give up. That night, I made a decision. I would continue sharing my story, but I would do so with even more honesty, more vulnerability. I would speak about the struggles, too, the times when love feels impossible, when forgiveness feels out of reach, when life feels like too much. I would speak about the reality that not every marriage would survive, but that didn't mean love had failed. It meant we had to try again. As the speaking tour began, I found that Sarah's message was just one of many that mirrored my own fears. The crowds were diverse, young, old, single, married, divorced, or somewhere in between. But the message remained the same. People were longing for connection, for love that was real and unshakable. One evening, after a particularly emotional talk, I was approached by a man named Richard. He was in his early 40s, his face worn with the kind of exhaustion only years of struggle can bring. "I came here tonight because I thought I needed to hear you talk about marriage," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But what I really needed to hear was about forgiveness. I wasn't sure what to say at first. "Forgiveness?" I asked, not fully understanding. "I've been separated from my wife for 3 years," Richard continued. "I've held on to so much anger. I thought if I just kept hating her, it would protect me, but hearing you talk tonight, I realized that I've been holding myself captive all this time." His words struck me to my core. "What are you going to do now?" I asked softly. "I'm going to call her," Richard said with determination in his eyes. "I'm going to ask her to meet me, not to fix everything, but just to listen, to start healing." I could see the weight lifting from his shoulders, a shift happening right before my eyes. It wasn't a perfect ending, and I wasn't sure where it would lead, but it was a start. And that, I realized, was enough. In the weeks that followed, I continued to speak, to share, to open my heart to anyone who would listen. Each conversation, each story, added a layer to my understanding of love and marriage. It wasn't just about the romantic ideals we see in movies. It was about commitment, trust, vulnerability, and yes, forgiveness. And as I spoke, I noticed something shifting within me. The doubt that had once held me back was beginning to fade. I wasn't just sharing my story anymore. I was living it. Every day, I was choosing love in my marriage, in my role as a mother, in the way I connected with the people I met. I still didn't have all the answers, and I still had moments of uncertainty. But I knew one thing for sure. The journey I had started, this journey of love, of marriage, of healing, wasn't one I would ever stop walking. And maybe that was the message I had been meant to share all along. As the months went on, the work became more demanding, and the responsibility grew heavier. I was no longer just speaking about my experience. I was guiding others through their own pain and uncertainty. With each new encounter, I felt a deeper sense of purpose, but also a growing tension. It was as if the weight of all the brokenness I saw around me was pressing in, demanding that I do something more. One evening, after a particularly long day of speaking and meetings, I found myself at home, feeling both empty and full at the same time. The house was quiet, but in my mind, the noise of it all was deafening. The constant demands, the endless conversations, the unspoken expectations that somehow I had to have all the answers. I sat in the darkened living room, my thoughts racing. What if I'm not enough? I whispered to myself. What if all these people are looking to me for something I can't give them? The weight of it threatened to crush me, and for a moment I wondered if I should walk away from it all, stop speaking, stop sharing. Maybe I wasn't the person they needed after all. Just then, Daniel walked in, his face weary but still filled with that steady calm that always seemed to anchor me. He sat beside me, his hand finding mine, and for a moment we were both just still. "Jenna," he said softly, "you don't have to have all the answers, you never did. You just have to keep being faithful to the message you've been given. That's enough." His words were a lifeline, pulling me from the swirling thoughts that had threatened to drown me. I squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. "I just don't know if I can keep doing this," I admitted, my voice cracking. "There's so much pressure, Daniel. I feel like I'm losing myself in all of it. I want to help. I want to be there for people, but sometimes it feels like I'm the one who needs saving." Daniel didn't say anything at first. He simply pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as if he understood the depth of my struggle without needing to say a word. In that moment, I realized something profound. I had been so focused on helping others that I had neglected to take care of myself. I had been running on empty, trying to pour into others without refilling my own cup. "I think you need to take a step back," Daniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "You can't pour from an empty cup, Jenna. You need to rest, to breathe. You're still healing, too." His words settled over me like a gentle rain, and I knew he was right. I had been running from one event to the next, always giving, always speaking, but never pausing to take a breath. I had been so afraid of losing the momentum that I hadn't realized I was losing myself in the process. The next few days were quiet. I canceled some of my upcoming speaking engagements and spent time at home with Daniel and the boys. I read, I prayed, I took long walks in the park, letting the stillness wash over me. It wasn't easy to slow down, but it was necessary. I needed to reconnect with the source of the message I had been given, to remind myself why I had started this journey in the first place. It was during one of those quiet moments that I heard the voice again. Not the booming voice that had spoken to me during my near-death experience, but a whisper, gentle, reassuring. "You are not alone, Jenna. I will never leave you." The words felt like a balm to my soul. I had been so caught up in the demands of the world, in trying to fix everything, that I had forgotten to lean into the truth I had been shown. That I wasn't carrying this alone. Over the next few weeks, I found myself in a new rhythm. I continued to speak, but with more balance. I focused on sharing the message of love, forgiveness, and commitment, but I also made space for my own healing. I took time for my family, for myself, for the quiet moments that reminded me of who I was beyond the work. And as I continued this new pace, I began to see the fruits of it in the way I connected with others. The messages I received were still powerful, but they no longer felt like burdens I had to carry. I saw them as reminders that my story, my journey, was not just for me. It was for everyone who needed to hear it, to find their own path toward healing and love. One evening, as I prepared for another speaking engagement, I received a call from a familiar voice. It was Sarah, the woman who had written to me months ago about her marriage. "Jenna," she said, her voice full of emotion, "I just wanted to thank you again." After the counseling, my husband and I decided to renew our vows. We're starting over in a way, and I know it's going to be hard, but we're committed to trying. "You saved my marriage." Tears filled my eyes as I listened to her words. It wasn't about me. It was about them, their willingness to fight for each other, to forgive, to rebuild. But somehow my story had been the spark that lit the fire. As I hung up the phone, I knew that this journey, this calling, wasn't about perfection. It was about love. It was about choosing it every day, even when it was hard. It was about the willingness to try again, to forgive, to hold on to hope. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace with my role in it all. It wasn't about being the perfect messenger. It was about being faithful to the message and trusting that it would reach the hearts it was meant to. Because in the end, love was always the answer. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We all have our battles, but love, forgiveness, and the willingness to try again can make all the difference. Stay faithful, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in the power of love.